So we're going to be delving into some very, very rich material tonight. And in the course of our discussion, we want to talk about at least four various topics. We want to talk about eligibility requirements for marriage. We want to talk about marriage systems that involves polygyny versus monogamy. And I'm going to try to provoke you a little into why you believe that monogamy is better than having a lot of wives. Then we want to talk about bride wealth payments. And then we want to talk about where people live after they get married. So that's our basic topic of discussion for tonight. And I remind you that we're working our way around this circle of cultural institutions. We've talked about production systems. We've talked about economic systems. Now we're going to jump down to marriage systems, which is down there in the lower left-hand quarter. And we're going to talk about the whole question of who can marry and what marriage is all about. So let's begin by talking about eligibility requirements. And we're going to have to answer two fundamental questions. Who can marry whom? Now, marriage is a very uniquely human trait. Animals will mate. Some of them will mate for life. Some of them will have quite promiscuous sexual relationships. Some, even as you would have in a troop of monkeys, in gorillas, will have a dominant male who will lay claim to all of the females in the troop. But human beings are unique in as much as they have a socially acceptable means, and this is found in virtually every culture, in which a man and a woman pair off and become then uniquely bonded to one another. And the question is, who can marry whom? And a second question is, who can be intimate with whom? Now, I'm trying to be delicate in the use of words here, but that question really is, who can you have sexual relationships with, whether you get married or not? Who is an eligible sexual partner for someone else? So we're talking about two kinds of things: sexual intimacies and marital relationships. Well, there are three kinds of regulations that are going to impact our discussions. And these three kinds of regulations will impact the manner in which we answer both of those questions. Because the three kinds of regulations that virtually every culture has established are what we call endogamy, exogamy, and incest. Now, I hate to throw a lot of technical terms at you. If there's an easier way to say it, I like to use plain English. But every discipline has its special language, and these happen to be special languages, and you probably ought to know these words. Hint, hint, for the exam. Endogamy, exogamy, and incest. Let's talk a little bit about these three terms. Endogamy. Endogamy means that you must marry someone inside of your group, however you want to define your group. Now, you can define your group as race. So you have to say, look, you have to marry somebody who is white like us, or black like us, or even Aryan like us, see, which was very, very typical of the Nazi regime. You had to marry an Aryan. You couldn't marry a person of Jewish ancestry. So anybody who has to marry inside of a group is practicing then what we call endogamous marital regulations. We have an endogamous requirement for marriage as Christians. What is that endogamous requirement?
Must be believers.
You must marry another believer. Okay. Paul says, what do we have to do with non-believers? Believers ought to marry believers. Now that's marrying within a group. Now that's endogamy. Now we could narrow that down even further by saying, okay, not only must you marry somebody of your own faith, you must marry somebody within your own social class. Furthermore, we could narrow it down. You must marry somebody that is a Biola grad or Biola student. So, well, we have these kinds of regulations, and cultures have practiced them. Well, in contrast to endogamy, we have what we call exogamous marriage relationships. And in an exogamous marriage relationship, you must marry someone outside of your group. Okay. You can't marry someone within your group. So an exogamous marriage requirement would be you cannot marry anybody that is a fellow Biola student. You must marry somebody from Westmont, see, or Moody Bible Institute, or Seattle Pacific, or if you really want to marry close to home, Azusa Pacific. See. You cannot marry anybody from Biola. It's against the rules. See. Now that would be an exogamous marriage requirement. You have to marry outside. Well, that helps to define who can marry whom, and everything then hinges on how we define our group. And every culture will determine what the group shall be defined as. The third regulation will be incest. And incest is a regulation that states that you may not be intimate with anybody within a certain group. It is a prohibition against sexual activity with a certain group of people. Now let me describe a little bit what is happening in respect to incest. In incest, you have incest regulations that are found in virtually every culture. There is not a culture in the world that does not have some kind of incest regulation. Now that's important, because when you have a universal characteristic, we are now in a situation where we have a significant phenomenon that needs to be explained, and every culture has an incest regulation. Now, not all cultures have the same incest regulations. See, for instance, some cultures have exceptions for royalty. The English, for instance, or even Europeans in general, have an exception for royalty. Royalty must marry royalty. See, Princess Di was selected as one of a very small group of women who would be eligible to marry the future prospective king of England. Okay. So there were these regulations. Now, Hawaiian royalty was the same way. In Hawaiian royalty, the kingly family, the royal family, was considered to be so special that they could not touch commoners. They could not have any kind of relationship with commoners. It was dangerous. And so the only person that the king could marry would be somebody within his immediate family who had that same royal protection. And so while there were incest regulations that regulated sexual behavior all through the Hawaiian Islands, here was the king marrying his own sister. Now you want to talk about one reason why I would never want to be king. My sister? Yuck! Another one of those chokers, you know. But he had to. It was one of the exceptions. Well, why this need for incest regulations? I mean, after all, let's face it. How many people really are interested in marrying their brothers or sisters? I mean, talk about gag a maggot. Most of us we just want to get away from the pesky little things, or if they're older, the bossy older sisters, or whatever, you know. Why do we have to have incest regulations for family members if it's something we don't want to do? Well, anthropologists have tried to come up with a number of reasons, because there's this compelling need to explain why virtually every culture has incest regulations. And they have come up with a series of lines of reasoning that try to explain incest regulations in every culture. Biological reasons, socio-political reasons, or what we would call safety in the home reasons. Now, the safety in the home reasons is my own addition. Most of them try the biological and socio-political reasons, and I'd like to discuss some of these in detail because I think there's an important point here that we need to learn. For instance, when we talk about the biological reasons, the reasons that people have given for incest regulations is that biologically, if you have too much sexual activity between close relatives, you will have biological inbreeding and a major series of genetic and health problems that will arise. As a matter of fact, what is one of the outstanding diseases or sicknesses that you can get from too much inbreeding? What was the problem that affected the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia? Hemophilia. Yes. Hemophilia. Hemophilia in their son. See? And folk have attributed that, whether rightly or wrongly, to the fact that there was just too much close inbreeding. But it was a very important factor because here they had this hemophiliac son. And of course, if you know anything about Russian history, you know that they turned to Rasputin to try to bring healing and health to their family, and all of the problems that came about as a result of their affiliation with Rasputin. Well, this is probably the reason why we have been taught, or the reason that's been given to us, about not looking romantically upon a close relative. I remember as a youngster, just at the age where I was beginning to realize that there's a difference between boys and girls. Up to that point, guys are pretty clueless. But all of a sudden, I began to notice that there's something rather attractive and appealing to my playmates of the opposite sex. And I was at a 4th of July picnic, and I remember seeing this very, very delightful-looking redheaded girl who was my same age at the picnic. And I nudged somebody and said, "Who's that?" And they said, "That's your cousin. Don't even think about getting interested." Yeah, that did, cousin. See, completely out of the picture. Can't even be friends now. See, typical 12-year-old. Well, we've developed these concepts of inbreeding, but you want to know something? We have really over-exaggerated the dangers of inbreeding from marriage with family relatives. Actually, there is absolutely no danger of marrying as long as you marry first and second cousins. There's no problem. And as a matter of fact, you're going to see shortly, first and second cousin marriage was actually widely practiced through cultures right up through the time of Abraham, right into the time of Moses. And as a matter of fact, there's not even any major danger with marrying immediate relatives, brothers and sisters marrying, for instance, except if it is practiced over the long run, and then you start getting genetic isolation, and then you will start running into problems. So that, for instance, when we talk about Adam and Eve, who did their sons marry? Well, they married their sisters. Immediately we go, oh no, they married their sisters. Well, you have to realize at this point that genetic mutations hadn't begun to significantly change. The human body was less prone to deviation than it is now, and it only lasted a few generations before incest regulations started to kick in, because by the time we get up into the Genesis 12, 13, and 14, already we're beginning to see the first evidences of incest regulations kicking in. So this idea of having to prevent inbreeding has been greatly exaggerated, but there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about it when we get a little bit further along. There are social-political reasons Anthropologists have argued that incest regulations were created along with exogamous requirements, and that the reason for this was that they were trying to force people to think in terms of sexual partners or marriage partners outside of the group in order to create stronger alliances with your neighbors. So it was a way of ensuring peace between two related clans or two clans sharing the same geographical region. So we'll give our daughters to you and you give your sons to us and vice versa, and we'll marry each other, and as our children marry and we have grandchildren shared between us, then that will make us stronger allies. And so they have reasoned that the incest regulations were part of a whole process of trying to form these larger bonds. Now, there is a great deal of truth to this. I mean, after all, how did Solomon get 1,000 wives and concubines? It was through a whole system of political and social alliances. Every time they made peace with another neighboring tribe or neighboring group, they would give one of their daughters to Solomon to marry, so that that would be kind of a cementing of the peace alliance between them. And so the giving and exchanging of wives is a very long-standing tradition. As a matter of fact, we have an interesting story in the Old Testament when one of the daughters of one of the children of Israel went out, and she was on a date with a guy. I don't know what else to call it. She was on a date, and we have a classic case here of date rape. See? And so she gets date raped, comes home, tells her brothers that she's been violated. She gets violated. They get angry as all get out. And so they go storming over to the family of the man. And, oh, they're all apologetic. Look, my son really loves your daughter, really wants to have her. Look, why can't we just make a pact? See, why don't we just become friends? My son really wants your daughter for his wife. Why don't we make this pact and we'll exchange sons and daughters? See, you can marry our girls and we'll marry yours, and it would just be one big happy family. And the Israelites are incensed at this, so they come up with a plan. And the plan is, okay, we'll do it, but you have to be circumcised first, because we can't allow any of our daughters to marry men that aren't circumcised. Now, okay, we'll agree. So all the men get circumcised. And then the scripture says, and the next day when they were all sore, ooh, what a succinct way to put it. When they were all sore, the men of Israel fell upon them and killed every man in that particular group. Now, who am I talking about? Any of you know that story? Tamar. Yes, it was the rape of Tamar. Do you remember the story? Oh, you better. I mean, the story's filled with all kinds of exciting, interesting stuff like this, see? And as you study anthropological data, it takes on even greater kind of significance and importance as you begin to realize all that's happening here. And they are one angry group of people. They don't want stronger allies, see? And they were not about ready to take up this issue of forming an alliance with people that they had no esteem for. Well, it is also a way of forming more stable economic ties within the community. One of the things that marrying into larger families does is it gives you more in-laws that are obligated to help you. So if I've got a wife from a large family, I can always ask all of her brothers to come help me put in a garden that will help her have a place to grow more food, or to raise her pigs, or to do whatever she's got to do. So we create then stronger, stable economic ties. We've got relatives that we can fall back on. If anything happens here in our area, a landslide wipes out our garden, we can go over to our in-laws' place and live with them. Or if there is an economic downturn, we can call upon the members of our family. Well, we do this. I mean, we do this even in modern societies. I grew up in a family with 7 boys. not a sister among us. See, 7 boys, large family, living in a very poor section of inner city Toronto, and my mother's sister would regularly take me every summer to live out in the country with her, fatten me up, feed me, get me some good fresh air, and not have to spend a hot, muggy summer in the inner city, very, very depressed areas of Toronto. And so I had all these wonderful summers. Well, what they were doing was, here were these 2 sisters helping to broaden out the economic imbalance that existed between our very large family that was very poor with their family that was small, urban, or rural, I should say, and really kind of well-to-do. So they were creating an economic balancing that would help us to more successfully meet the requirements that were upon us. Well, we can give still a 3rd set of reasons, and that is safety and security reasons. Safety and security reasons. This is an argument that I will postulate that the purpose of incest regulations was created by societies as a means of protecting women within the culture. In some cultures, incest is the most heinous crime that you can engage in. In Donny culture, in the 20 years that I was there, we had 1 case of incest. A man violated his niece. Now, incest regulations, at least in Donny culture, was punishable by death. The brothers of this man were so incensed that he had violated the incest regulations of his society that they came, they tied him up, they carried him strapped to a pole out into the forest, and they stuck him face first down into a hollow stump of a tree. And they left him there, bound up, upside down, in a hollow log. Now, you know what lives inside of hollow logs? Bugs. Lots of bugs. And ants and things. And those bugs and ants and things began to attack all of the soft tissues of his face. You know, nose, eyes, lips, things like that. And he screamed, and he hollered, and they ate away until he died an agonizing death, and nobody was allowed to pull him out of there until he had died this excruciatingly painful death. We didn't have incest in Donny culture because everybody knew that it would not be tolerated. Well, there is this need to protect your children, protect your women, protect your wives within the security of the home. And I am convinced that this is what takes place. And I would like to test my conclusions, my hypotheses, against what we see in the Bible. And so I'd like to take us on a very, very quick biblical review of marital patterns in the Scriptures. So let's go back to Adam's generation. In Adam's generation, what happened? As far as we can tell, they married their own sisters. Brothers had to marry their own sisters because there was no other women around. The sisters are not listed in the genealogies because they're not important to the genealogies. So they are left out. So we can only speculate about women at this early stage of the history of the human race. But this seems to be the most viable alternative. This takes place for a few generations. By the time we get up to Abraham's generation, in chapter 12, incest is beginning to already manifest itself. And who knows for how long before then. We discover that in Abraham's generation, people could marry, as a matter of fact, were supposed to marry their cousins. And when Lot left Sodom and Gomorrah, his daughters were dismayed because there was nobody that they knew who could be eligible for them to marry. And they did not want to be left childless. And so you remember the story of how they get their father drunk and bear a child by their own father, each of the girls. Well, the Bible records this. It is a shocking story because here is an emerging study of incest, and in contrast to this is the story of Abraham and of the manner in which he followed what was then biblically acceptable standards. Let's take a quick look at what those are. You have Sarah and Abraham up there on the left-hand corner. Abraham has a brother, Nahor. Sarah and Abraham have a son, Isaac. Abraham wants his son to marry who? There are women all over the place. He doesn't want his son to marry just anybody. He wants his son to marry somebody that will be acceptable within their particular marital patterns, preferably a cousin. So we move over to Nahor's line. His own brother, Abraham's brother, has indeed had a son, Bethuel. Bethuel has a daughter, Rebekah. So Rebekah becomes then a second cousin. Second cousin marriage is approved. Isaac and Rebekah get married, and you know the whole story about how Abraham's good servant goes all the way there, and he comes to the well and all this sort of stuff, and she falls desperately in love with Isaac, and they have this wonderful relationship, and they bear two sons, Esau and Jacob. Now, who's Jacob going to marry? Interestingly enough, Jacob marries his own cousin. He marries, matter of fact, he marries two of them, Leah and Rachel. At this level, first and second cousin marriage is still approved in the scriptures. But we move further on up. We move beyond Moses, or beyond Abraham, and we move up to Moses' generation. And we discover a couple of interesting new developments. By this time, endogamy has become a fixed feature of marriage regulations. But you can marry, but it doesn't have to be somebody that is just a cousin, first or second. It can be somebody who is committed to the Hebrew faith. So it's all right that Joseph has married an Egyptian woman. It's all right that Moses himself will take an Ethiopian woman as his wife. You can marry outside of your culture. You can marry outside of your lineage, outside of your clan, but you must maintain the marriage within a faith perspective. They must agree to become Hebrews. See, they must identify with the Hebrew people. So it's endogamous by faith, not by race. The male has the right to the choice. Now this principle carries up all the way up through the period of Ruth, see, because here's Ruth, goes off with, Ruth comes into the lineage, see, as a result of her mother and her sons going to another place, the sons marrying local girls, and of course Ruth coming back with her mother-in-law when everybody dies, or at least all the males die. Well, something else is happening here during the time of Moses. Moses institutes the law, and the law specifies incest. Now you have endogamous marriage requirements that are listed. You also have the defining of incest, and these incest requirements are defined very, very clearly for us in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 1 through 18. And in Leviticus 18, 1 through 18, there are how many? 11 categories of people that are defined. Let me quickly run through what these 11 categories are. First of all, it is not permissible for an individual, ego, to have sexual relationships with his mother or his stepmother. Secondly, he may not have sexual relationships with his sister or his half-sister. He may not have sexual relationships with his daughter, his daughter-in-law, or his granddaughter. The list is growing. Oh, it's going to get even more hairy. We're going to add to this paternal aunts and sister-in-laws. We're going to add another group, stepdaughters. A second wife's daughter by another man, or your wife's sister. Now, here are these 11 categories that have all been defined for us. Let's go back and take a look at them and ask, what is the purpose of the incest laws as we find them in Leviticus? What does all of this show us? As we look at that list, we discover that it does not include all of Ego's blood relatives. For instance, it doesn't cover his maternal aunts, nor does it cover his nieces. Now, this would be important if the reasons for incest should be biological. If you don't want people marrying you, your children who are closely related to them, then you ought to include these people, and yet they are significantly left out. Secondly, these categories do include some non-blood relatives. So if it was a biological motivation, then these people should not have been included in there because they have no biological relationship to ego, and yet non-blood relatives are included. So I come to the conclusion that biological reasons are insufficient to explain at least the basis for the Moses requirements, the Jewish requirements on incest. So I find myself having to look still further for a reason why God would have directed Moses to make incest regulations in the manner that they were made. And I will come up with what I believe is a functionalist interpretation of incest in the Bible. I'm going to look through all my anthropological toolkits to try to find a line of reasoning that will help to explain this particular set of data. And I think I find it in what we call functionalism. That is, what was the function of taboo? Or what was the function of incest? My conclusion is that it was a taboo. Let me list it this way. Incest taboos. Incest taboos. What does that mean? That means there's a prohibition. A taboo is a prohibition. So incest prohibitions were given by Moses on all of those women who were most likely to live together or to associate in one house. So that if I represent ego in that chart, the women who are going to be part of the household in which I live, my sisters, people who are married to members of my family, their close relatives, others who will have to come into my household, who will be regularly visiting us, informally visiting us, and particularly, if you go back to the Middle Eastern culture, where women wear the veil, the head covering, a place where they can take the veil down, take the head covering off, shake out their hair and let it come down, and be comfortable and at home. This is the kind of home that they're living in. All of these women need a safe place to let their hair down, literally, take off the face mask, and not worry that somebody will come into the room unexpectedly and find that they are being eyed with sexual desire. It appears to me that by making these people off bounds to any kind of sexual activity, you are creating a safe environment for women to live without the fear of unwanted sexual advances. It's a place where they could be comfortable with men. Incest taboo made women non-sexual objects, if you would, to the men of the household. Now, if that is indeed the case, we have a very interesting kind of phenomenon taking place, because what we need to do now is move to a contemporary understanding of incest. How do we define incest today? Well, we've already talked about how we still have endogamous marriage requirements. That is, we ought to marry believers. We do have incest taboos, but these have become very, very vague. And incest has lost its primary focus upon creating a safe environment. What has happened instead is we have changed our incest regulations to focus upon biological reasons. And biological reasons are really very, very weak. So what has happened is that the incest regulations that as they currently exist in our culture have become so weak that they are no longer effective barriers against sexual activity within the household. And the result has been that the homes have become the most unsafe places in America. Now, if I read the statistics correctly, 1 in every 5 women will experience some kind of unwanted sexual activity, either date rape or unwanted sexual activity perpetrated upon them by somebody else. By far, the smallest amount of those violations will be what we call stranger rape. You know, where you're just walking into the parking lot and get grabbed and hauled in behind the building. That's the fewest number of incidences of sexual violation. The highest number of sexual violations in our culture are violations that take place within the home or by someone who is a known member of the family. And the home has become literally the unsafest place in the whole culture. Women, particularly young children, are very, very vulnerable in their homes. And this has been compounded by the problem of broken and reconstituted families. Because when you have broken homes, mother brings in a boyfriend, and the boyfriend will oftentimes violate the girls in the family, or they will bring in a stepfather, and stepbrothers or even stepfathers will violate their stepfamily members. And we have this tremendous surge of broken promises to young children in the home as a result of the failure of the culture to provide a safe environment. Now, I bring all that to our attention because this has become a major issue in the 1990s as psychologists have continued to probe this question of incest and of its impact upon society. And I would like to give you a contemporary definition of incest that was written by a woman by the name of Sue Bloom, who has written a book called Secret Survivors. Now, Ms. Bloom, I'm not sure quite how to refer to her because she is a strong feminist advocate. She is very hostile toward Christianity. She is hostile toward men, and she writes a very blunt and anti-male book. But she has some good things to say, and one of them is this definition of incest, and I'm going to read it to you. Incest is the imposition of sexually inappropriate acts or acts with sexual overtone by, or any use of a minor child to meet the sexual or sexual emotional needs of one or more persons who derives authority through ongoing emotional bonding with that child. Now, do you follow the details of that particular definition of incest? It is the imposition of sexual activities upon a minor by someone who wants to satisfy their own needs, not that of the child, and it is perpetrated by someone who has an ongoing emotional bonding with that child. Do you notice how this states that this is nothing to do with blood relatives? It defines inappropriate sexual activity, or as incestuous activity, anything in which there is an emotional bonding. An emotional bonding. So that even if the person isn't related, they're just a family friend. If there's a strong emotional bonding, then that is described by E. Sue Bloom as incest. Let me give you an illustration. A few years ago, one of our large local churches had a scandal break out on it. One of the members of the church, who had been in times past an elder in that church, a person who was very active in missions, who had been working with that church to create an ongoing ministry, who had become well known in a number of the families, was discovered to have sexually violated a number of young girls in those homes. He would come by, he would visit, he would sexually abuse the girls in these families, young girls, and it happened to a number of families. When the news began to break, families who all knew this man began to talk to their children. The stories began to come out, and next thing you know, we've got several families who have pulled together, who have said, it happened to us. Our daughter was molested by this man. Now, he was not a family relative. He was just a family friend, but he was well known. He would come into the family and, oh yeah, here's Uncle so-and-so, just kind of calling him uncle because he's such a family figure. As far as E. Sue Bloom is concerned, that man, while he had no biological relationship to these girls, was creating an incestuous situation because there was an ongoing emotional bonding with those children. Now, that's a far cry from the traditional definition of incest. But I bring your attention to it now because something very important is happening in American culture. We are having to confront incest as we have never had to confront it before in our culture. See? And we're having to confront it because of a whole series of problems, and this attempt to define incest in its broadest terms, I think, actually moves us closer to an understanding of what the biblical concept was. The home ought to be a safe place. And we need to look at one another in a manner that allows us to be safe in one another's presence. And do you remember the Apostle Paul writing to his protege, Timothy? And he says, Timothy, here's how you are to relate to women in your ministry. How is he to relate to them? You are to treat the old women like your mother. You are to treat the young women as your sisters. See? Don't look at them as sexual objects. They are to be non-sexual objects. They are to be treated as if they were within the bonds of an incest regulation. You are to treat them with dignity, with respect, with care. They need to be safe in your environment. And if there's anything that I can do to challenge you is, you men, be men with whom it is safe to be if you are a woman. And if you are that kind of safe person, believe me, God will magnify your ministry. And people will feel that safety. People will feel that safety. Jesus was that kind of a person. And he attracted a following that had been totally neglected in Hebrew culture. Well, there are some problems with E. Bloom's definition. I'm not sure that I completely am happy with it. It totally ignores blood relationships, and I think that that somehow ought to be brought in. It totally ignores adult relatives who live in close emotional proximity, so that it only talks about child-adult relationships. It doesn't talk about incestuous relationships between consenting adults, and it doesn't really satisfactorily handle childhood sexual explorations, if I can call it that, where children of the same age kind of just wondering how come they're different when they get in the bathtub and discover that their anatomy is different. And sometimes it goes beyond just looking. And how do you handle that kind of activity? So there is, I think, a bit of a problem here between incest and molestation, which Ms. Bloom doesn't fully address. But I nevertheless advocate the position that she is taking, that we need to take a larger view of what constitutes incest. Well, let's move beyond this topic, because that's only part of the whole subject. We've got to get on to marriage. So we've been talking about sexual regulations for people who are not married. What about marriage? And we really need to talk about some basic terminology, because our basic terminology here is going to set us up for a series of fairly important discussions as the evening wears on here. So we're talking about polygamy. Polygamy is that broad term that refers to the taking of more than one spouse, either husband or wife. So polygamy is being married to more than one person. We can narrow that by calling one type of polygamy polygyny. Polygyny is the taking of more than one wife. Men having 2, 3, or more wives. And this happens in 75% of the cultures of the world that have been studied. So if it's such a bad idea, how come so many cultures have embraced it? We're going to come back to that question later on, see, because I'm going to ask you, why would men or women even put up with having other women in the house as part of the marriage relationship? There is what we call polyandry. Polyandry is the second form of polygamy. Polyandry is one woman taking more than one husband. Well, you can see how popular that is. That only happens in about 1% of the cases in the world. Guys apparently don't like to share wives, but are quite willing for women to share the same husband. Is this a double standard or what? Well, we'll get into that. Then there is what we call sororal marriage. And sororal marriage is the practice of marrying sisters. So it is a form of polygyny in which I would not only marry a woman, but I would marry a woman and her sister. And of course we see that in the Old Testament. That was an acceptable practice in certain cultures and was allowed. Now I won't say that it was ever definitely approved, but interestingly enough, God nevertheless blessed the one sororal marriage case that takes place in the line of godly Israel. And God often does bless, even when we get our marriages all mixed up and messed up, and our marriage isn't exactly perfect, God nevertheless does bless us if we submit our hearts to Him. There is also what we call levirate marriage. And levirate marriage was a Hebrew custom, and that was where you would marry your widowed sister-in-law. So if your brother dies, you get to take her as your wife. And of course, this is the whole basis of the story of Ruth and of Boaz. And whether Boaz was already married or not is, interestingly enough, never mentioned. But it wasn't important. You don't mention unimportant details in a story like that. You only mention the important things. And the important thing was that he did the right thing by marrying this widow of his family. Well, we have, in addition to these, monogamy, which is marrying only one spouse. We know what monogamy is because it's what is practiced in most of our cultures here. Well, actually, we have a variation of monogamy in our culture. We have what has come to be known as serial monogamy. Serial monogamy. That is, you can only be married to one woman at a time, but you can have as many wives as you want as long as you keep it down to one at a time. And so, we have someone like Liz Taylor, for instance. Good old famous, or is it infamous, Liz Taylor. She married her last husband that they met in a rehab center out in the desert. And both of them recovering from drug abuse. And it didn't work out too well. And so they settled for a divorce. And what did Liz Taylor say after that divorce? I don't think I'll ever get married again. I don't think I need to get married again. I'll just live with them. See? She's just going to take sweethearts or lovers or whatever. No more marriage for Liz Taylor. Well, see, she's had a whole series of husbands. And as long as she sticks to it one at a time, everybody blows it off as, okay, that's the privilege of our marriage system. Well, that raises an interesting question. Why even get married? What is the basis of marriage? Why is it that people want to get married? Is it a luxury that we can do without? What do men look for in a woman? And what do women look for in a man? Now, let me ask you some questions. Let me ask you guys first. You gals, listen up. Here's a chance for you to find out what guys are looking for. What are you guys looking for in a woman? In the woman that you want to marry? Give me some traits of the desirable qualities of a woman that you're looking for. Duh.
Compassionate and servant-hearted.
Say that again?
Compassionate and servant-hearted.
Compassionate and servant-hearted. Okay? Is that going to do it?
Desire sexual heart.
Alrighty. Anything else? They want to hear what you said. They couldn't hear in the back.
Sexual desire.
Okay, sexually desirable. He's being honest. He's being honest. Let's face it. Let's face it. When I asked the Donnies, what are you looking for? That was one of the two qualifications. I mean, men are men everywhere you go. All right, what else are you guys looking for? Is that it?
Moral values. Moral values.
Moral value.
All right.
Trust.
We got 3 qualifications. I think most of you gals can meet that, can't you? You can wear lingerie and, let's not go too far with this. What else are you looking for?
Something I think also very important is being spiritually compatible. You know,
Spiritual compatibility. All righty. What else are you guys looking for? You gals listening, you can take notes, because, I mean, this is your chance. What else are you guys looking for?
Trust. Connect.
Trust. All right, trust. All right, that's 5 reasons. That's plenty enough. You guys aren't that picky. Let me ask you gals. You guys, you can listen up now. All right? You gals, what are you looking for in a guy?
Godliness. Godliness.
Godliness. Oh my goodness. Well, that's half of us out of here. Godliness. What else are we looking for?
Sincereness. Sincereness.
Sincereness. There goes 25% more. What else are we looking for?
Honesty.
Honesty. You would say that just before income tax time. What else are we looking for?
Faithful.
Faithfulness. What else are we looking for?
Sensitivity.
Sensitivity. Oh, we might as well all leave at this point. Blew that one. Sensitivity. What else are you looking for?
Friendship.
Friendship. Interesting. Right. Can friends make good husbands? Sure. You haven't seen the movie When Sally Met Harry, or is it When Harry Met Sally? I don't know. Anyway, they've been friends for years and they finally got married. A great story. Okay, friendship. What else are you gals looking for?
Same vision in life.
What was that?
Same vision in life.
Oh, same vision. Oh my goodness. These gals, I mean, there are requirements. Well, are these reasons to get married? Are these reasons unique for getting married? Now, basically what I've done is I closed off the screen here to get your answers, but let's look at what the scriptures have to say. Why did God give man a wife? Let's look to see what was the original purpose. And when we go back to the original purpose, when we go back to Adam, we find Adam having this marvelous time cavorting there in the Garden of Eden, naming all the animals. And at the end of the day of naming the animals, what happens to Adam? Is he rejoicing at creation? Is he full of wonderment and excitement and exuberance? No. He's downright depressed. His jaw drops down to his shin bones. God says, "What's the matter, Adam?" He says, "Everybody's got a mate but me. I'm all alone. By myself." See? So, God solves that problem. Puts him into a deep sleep and brings him out of that deep sleep to what? To a help meet. A help meet. What is a help meet? Now that's an old English word. See? A help meet. A help meet is an important partner in your life. And you know what? You hit on some of those. When you talked about a friend, somebody with shared vision, somebody who was trustworthy, somebody who was sincere. You were hitting on all of the essences of the kind of person that we are looking for in a partner who can come alongside of us. Somebody that is reliable, somebody that we can count on. Do you want to know something? While your terminology differs, these are the universal characteristics of what we look for in a spouse. They go all the way back to the biblical times. We need a helpmeet. And that helpmeet will be a partner in assisting us to do all that God desires for us to do. If it's a simple horticultural society, then that person becomes someone who comes alongside of you to help search for food. Somebody that will be in fellowship with you. Somebody that will help you in the care of creation. Actually, this is exactly what the Donnie said. When they wanted a woman, I said, "What do you guys look for in a gal?" They said, "We look for a gal who's really strong and healthy and who can really work in the gardens and who can produce food and who can raise healthy pigs." Wow. And then I said, "Is that all?" Oh, they said, "No, we'd like somebody that's desirable. Somebody that's desirable. Somebody who will help to fulfill that emotional need for a loving partner." Well, that's exactly what what all people are looking for. Now, we focus differently in our culture. Well, let me ask you this. What are the reasons that people give? The reasons that people give, see, are so culturally conditioned that while they reflect the cultural values, they nevertheless reflect this need for us to have somebody with whom we can be intimate, we can share who we are, we can feel fulfillment, and we can discover the fulfillment of God's purposes in our lives. And if we've got somebody who can create a safe home for our children, and a safe home for us, and a safe place to carry out God's commandments, that's the kind of person we're looking for. That's what marriage is all about. That's the biblical basis of marriage, and it's also a cultural basis. We're going to stop there, and when we get back, we're going to ask in the next question, if marriage is such a good thing, how many wives can we have? If it's a good thing, if one woman's good, two ought to be better, right? Well, we'll come back and we'll answer that question when we come back. Well, this question again. If marriage is such a good thing, if every culture has marriage, if all guys want a wife, and if all women want a husband, if it's such a great thing, one wife is wonderful, two wives ought to be luxurious, see, or more wives. How many wives is good? Well, this is a question that we really need to address as we look at what other cultures have done. Because what we discover is that, here we go, there we go, is that polygyny is found in 3/4 of the world's cultures. So 75% of the cultures, not 75% of the people, because some of these cultures represent very small numbers of people, but 75% of the world's cultures, people have found that having more than one wife is a good thing. I mean, I would assume it's a good thing since they keep doing it. I mean, can't you just see guys saying, oh, darn, 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 I got to take another wife. Oh, shoot. Oh, rats. My luck. I got to have 3 wives. I don't see anybody, see, complaining about having to take more wives. See, I see them complain about taking 1 wife, but never 2 or 3. See, so what is happening in cultures in which polygamy is practiced? First of all, I think one of the things we have to establish is that not everybody in a polygamous culture has more than 1 wife. You see, because the statistics, the study of polygamous cultures indicates that only the most qualified men are able to take more than 1 wife. Depending on the culture, perhaps only 1 in 4 men will take more than 1 wife. Perhaps only 1 in 5. Not every man can handle more than 1 woman. Matter of fact, some guys can't even handle 1 woman. It takes a good man to handle a large family. So, polygamous families are families in which you have an outstanding man who is able to offer something to the women that come into that family. What is it that they are able to offer? Well, when we look at polygamous cultures, we discover that women want stable unions. They don't want exclusive unions. They want stable unions. In many polygynous cultures, it is the women who want another wife in the family. It is the women who press for a second wife to come into the family as a junior wife. Multiple marriage situations are set up not by male-dominated societies always, but they can be something that is desirable on the part of other women. For instance, East Africa. In East Africa, women will sometimes browbeat their husbands. If you really love me, you'd take another wife. If you really love me, you'd have another woman in here to help me with all of these chores. You're working me to death. Don't you love me? Okay, all right, you talked me into it. I'll take another wife. You got anybody in mind? Yes, I've already picked her out. See? And the senior wife will bring in the junior wife and say, this is the girl I picked for you to be your second wife. See? Now, get on with it. Make all the arrangements. See? And so the women will push their men into having second wives. Well, all right, let's stop and reflect on this, Let's get over the shock of, oh my goodness, no. Let's ask ourselves a really fundamental question. What would be the advantages of introducing polygamy into the United States?
The advantages?
Oh, yes. What would be, let me give you a quotation here that will support a reason why we ought to have polygamy in the United States, all right? Here's an article I took out of the newspaper a while back. It was headlined New York, and it was out of an American Sociological Association meeting. And they stated, about 40% of women who have divorced recently while in their 30s will never remarry. Nor will about 70% of women who divorce when older than 40. These are according to the projections of a new study presented at the annual meeting of the American Sociological Association. Now, those are atrocious figures. 70% of women who divorced after the age of 40 will not be able to get married again. 40% of those still in their 30s will not be able to remarry. Why? What happens when a couple, let's say they're 38, a couple is 38 and they get a divorce? What happens to the guy? He gets remarried. What kind of woman does he remarry?
Younger.
A younger woman. See, somebody still in their 20s. See? So what does a 38-year-old wife do? Or ex-wife? All of a sudden, the pool of eligible 38-year-old men is diminishing. See? And so unless she wants to marry a 21-year-old guy, see? And I don't know many 21-year-old guys who want to marry a 38-year-old woman who's already got 3 kids, already beginning to get, So, here we've got this problem. A problem in which all of these delightful middle-aged women, 35 to 45, 48, who would provide marvelous companionship, and who would love to be in a stable household, who would love to have somebody help her raise the children, who would love to have a male figure around, and there's none available. They're all marrying younger women. So why don't we in America propose polygamy as an answer? Guys like me, stable, responsible, making a good salary, love to take one of these women who wants a caring relationship into my family. And my wife and I would welcomely embrace another woman into our family and raise their 2 kids. Be lovely to have kids around the place again. Why don't we advocate polygamy and allow older, stable people like Biola profs have more than one wife? Solve the emotional and family needs of all of these divorcees.
Taxes.
I don't think you like that idea. Why not? Have you ever given polygamy serious consideration? And I don't think so. So I'm going to give you the opportunity tonight. I am going to, in the next few minutes, suggest to you 7 or 8 good reasons why polygamy is a great idea. All right? Now, I want you just to listen to my 7 or 8 great ideas as to why polygamy is a wonderful idea. And when we get all done, then I want you to tell me where I've screwed up in my thinking, or better yet, you give me all the reasons why monogamy is a better idea, all right? I'm going to ask you to defend monogamy tonight. You believe in it, don't you? If you go to Africa, are you still going to believe in it? All right, then you ought to be able to defend it. See? All right, so let's work our way through. Number one. Well, number one reason why polygamy is a great idea is because it enhances reproductive success. You say, what? Reproductive success? What are you talking about? Let me give you an example. What are you looking for in a husband? Are you looking for a guy that's kind of emaciated, you know, looks like he's got calcium nutrition and a lot of other things, you know, he's already beginning to get stooped back and he's kind of thin and it looks like he's going to take a second breath and keel over? I mean, are you looking for a real wimpy kind of a guy? How many of you are attracted to wimpy guys? I don't think too many. So let's talk about Willie Wimpy. All right? Willie Wimpy. What chances does Willie Wimpy have for getting married? Not an awful lot. Women are not attracted to wimpy kinds of guys. And we've seen those kinds of guys in our culture. I mean, in our culture, it wasn't, you couldn't hide your physical defects very well. After all, if all you're wearing is a gourd, everybody can see whether you are normal or not. And there was a young man there that had a particular deficiency, and so he had very, very long gangly legs and very gangly features, and his male anatomy was not fully developed. It was very obvious. He couldn't hide it. He couldn't find a wife. Nobody wanted him because it was not evident that he could function as a husband. Now, he was desperate, but nobody wanted him. He tried everything he could to attract women. Women were not attracted to him. So, what kind of woman finally will marry this kind of a man? Well, if it's typical of the cultures that I've seen, the kind of woman that will marry him will be a woman who has been cast off by other men, a woman who herself is unable to bear children, or has a physical handicap, or has something that makes her less than desirable to the male population. And so Willie Wimpy finally meets a woman who is less than desirable, and they are unable to have children for whatever reasons. And so I have put down there 2 X's, 2 blanks. Nothing happens. Now we're going to come across a second characteristic. How many of you gals are attracted to steroid devouring muscle hunks? You know, guys who say, hey, want to see something really cool? Watch me flex, you know, and they begin to pump it all up, and you see the old, they strip their shirt off and you see the muscles begin to bulge. I mean, are you gals really attracted to muscle-bound guys? Why do guys do all of this then if women aren't attracted to it? Well, because other guys are attracted to it. Oh man, did you see his? Man, when he flexes, oh man, it pops out all over the place. Other guys are impressed, but I don't think women are too impressed. As a matter of fact, most gals find it ludicrous. As a matter of fact, quite often they'll start laughing at a guy as he's starting to pump, and they become very sensitive about that, as a matter of fact. Well, what happens when you have a macho guy? See, we'll call him Macho Mike, all right? Macho Mike, he gets married, some girl will be attracted to him. After all, Arnold Schwarzenegger managed to do it, Sylvester Stallone managed to do it. So what do they have? Well, because they're on steroids and other kinds of stuff, and or they're out there proving their macho stuff so much that they die prematurely, getting themselves into some kind of a fight or some defending the community or whatever. But they end up having a girl. So we put down there that he's lived long enough to at least have a girl. For them, their lives tend to be fairly short. Now let's deal with Mr. Average. See, Mr. Average. Guy, he's not real muscle bound. He's a normal kind of a guy. He can work an 8-hour day without tiring out too badly. He's a good, responsible man. He comes home, takes care of his family, makes sure that everybody's taken care of, meets the needs of the society. So we'll call him normal Norm. Kind of a guy that women are attracted to because he can provide stable relationships. He can provide the father role, father figure for their children, make sure that they are taken care of, make all of their needs met. And women are attracted to these kinds of people. As a result, normal Norm has women flocking all over him. And if his culture allows it, he takes in more wives. From those wives, he has more children. What do you notice happening here? The normal kind of a guy is producing more children than the culturally or physically marginal members of the society. So he is reproducing more of his kind of people so that the next generation, his gene pool is increasing at a much greater rate than the rate of those who are marginal to the society. I mean, talk about genetic selection and adaptation. This is the kind of thing that really turns on sociobiologists. See? Now, if this is what it takes, see, then we are taking the very best men and partnering them up with the very best women to ensure that we have the very best children. We are creating a culture of the beautiful people, see, through polygamy. We're weeding out all those guys with the long hair, the rings, chewing tobacco and all that kind of stuff, see, in favor of the hardworking, productive people. Well, what else about polygamy? Polygamy rewards the most capable people. Frankly, men look upon women as something desirable. Is that a surprise? Men like to have women attracted to them. They like to have the admiration of women. They like to earn the admiration of women. And in most societies, the ability to have more than one wife is considered to be a fitting reward for the most capable members of the society. See? So you reward hard work, responsibility, by giving additional women to those kinds of men. A third characteristic is that it reduces the onerous workload of maintaining a household. I mean, after all, wouldn't it be much easier to have two women and you only have to cook half as much? All right, every other day you're in the kitchen, see? I'll cook Mondays, you cook Tuesdays, I'll cook Wednesdays, you cook Thursdays, you know? When it comes to house cleaning, you just clean the upstairs, I'll clean the downstairs. You cut all of your workload in half. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Right. And especially when you've got such onerous tasks as having to haul water from the river or other kinds of things. It also helps with things like taking care of one another when you're sick. Oh, I've got a horrible headache today. I'm going to stay in bed all day. You take over. Okay, don't worry about it. See? Well, wouldn't it be helpful to have another woman around, take care of all those duties? 4, it fosters social harmony. The more in-laws you've got, the more people you have to make peace with. The more people you have to ensure that you're getting along well. And indeed, polygamous marriages were used and have been used for hundreds of years to help create social harmony and amity in a community. A 5th characteristic, it ensures that all women can have a husband. You see, not everybody in our culture can get married. There just aren't enough men to go around. And this is true in many cultures. And in some cultures, women are so valuable that it would be a crime not to allow them the possibility of being able to enter into a marriage relationship in which they can become all that they can become through a marriage relationship. And so they value their women so much that they ensure that everybody has a chance to get married. No unclaimed women in some societies. See? You buy that reasoning? Remember, you get a chance to respond in a little bit. A sixth characteristic, more wives helps to build a broader economic base for the family. Broader economic base. You've got two women now who can help to produce for the well-being of the family. They can help to meet the needs of the family. They can pool their resources if they're involved in any kind of outside employment. You've got two people that can help bring in wealth, or one that stays home and takes care of the family while the other goes out and earns an income, and maybe they can switch off. Well, wouldn't that be marvelous? See, I want to be the career mom. You take care of my children. I'll go off and be an advertising executive, and I can be all that I want to be and still have children too. Don't have to put them in some crazy daycare center. Well, a seventh characteristic is it may cement political alliances. Now, that wouldn't be so true in our culture, but it is a possibility that in some cultures this will cement political alliances, and it's one of the reasons why polygamy was so popular in many cultures. And with still an eighth characteristic, it may facilitate better marriages for your children if you have an endogamous marriage requirement that you have to marry within certain groups. And as you form more alliances through your multiple marriages, that's more families that you are allying with for your children to marry into those families. And so you're really doing your kids a favor by having more marriages, more families drawn into that circle that can then provide a pool of people for whom your sons can find a wife. Now, there are my 8 reasons why polygamy is a wonderful idea. Now, I would like to ask you, have I screwed up anywhere? Why is monogamy a better idea? Give me a defense of monogamy. Let's pretend I have just stepped off the shores, or just stepped off onto the shores of this country from a boat from Africa, and I have come like Eddie Murphy to America, looking for another wife to take back to my country in Africa because I believe in polygamy. Argue me out of polygamy.
After Korean War, so we have many widows because the men died. At that time, our society men want another woman, so they have marriage with the other women, so 2 or 3 sometimes. All our forefathers' generations, because they want to take care of the women. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your culture?
No.
No.
We don't.
No. You say polygamy is only for caring for widows?
I guess.
Oh, okay. Well, and that's kind of an important point. Are you aware that the reformers actually allowed polygamy in Europe for 1 generation? You know, the wars between the Catholics and the Protestants was so intense. There was a period of Protestant warfare, and the Catholic forces would come in and kill all the Protestants. Then the Protestants would come back and kill all of the Catholics. And then the Catholics would come in and they would kill off anybody that claimed to be, and villages just passed from one group to another until there was a shortage, an outright shortage of men in Europe. And finally the peace was made, and the most horrible atrocities of the Reformation were finally passed. And the reformers said, what do we do now? There aren't any men left. We've killed them all off. And so for 1 generation, the reformers allowed for men to have more than 1 wife in Europe until they could bring back the population stability that had resulted in the devastation of wars. Now, you don't read that much in theology textbooks, but it was an attempt to solve a problem. So I mean, here we even have it in the Protestant Reformation tradition as possible. Why don't we solve a problem for today for all of these lonely women who are looking for a good man and can't find one?
I see.
Here I am. Tell me it's wrong.
I see a flaw in your, profile. Your logic, because you talk about economic, political, and social, but you don't talk about spiritual.
Spiritual.
There is nothing.
Spiritual. Gollies, I did miss that, didn't you? Didn't I? Well, what about spiritual?
I'm talking about intimacy, that you lack the intimacy if husband has more wives or the wife has more husbands. So you don't have the bond, the trust bond we were talking about before.
Is there something about a spiritual bonding between a husband and a wife that takes place?
Absolutely.
Why couldn't that happen between two wives and one husband? I mean, after all, isn't the Trinity one? I mean, there's three in one. Yes?
Adam, 2 Eves.
Oh, Adam with 2 Eves. Well, let me put it first of all. First of all, it wasn't Adam and Steve. It was Adam and Eve. And why not 2 Eves? Did God screw up there? Is that an argument for monogamy, that the fact that God only created one?
Well, then we take the example of Christ and the church being a perfect marriage, and should Christ take on maybe the Mormon church or the Jehovah's Witnesses or something else, I think that would be a terrible thing, because the intimacy factor, as we go back to, would be violated. And there's some other issues as far as, okay, you're a broader economic base for the family, but well, that's not always true, because with more wives, you're going to have more children, and there's going to be more resources consumed. So that's not really a true assessment. I think that there could be ruin in that as well, because if you have a drought or you have a flooding or something, that would destroy your base of resources, and how are you going to feed all those mouths?
Well, actually, that's your argument is very interesting, because that's exactly the argument that Paul says for not getting married at all. He said, you know what, tough times are coming. I'd rather that you didn't get married at all, because it's going to be hard to have a wife. So don't get married at all. So if I follow your line of reasoning, I wouldn't go to monogamy. I'd go to abstinence.
To celibacy.
Celibacy. See? I'd say, all right, let's all go down to the clinic and get ourselves fixed. And we're not going to have any marriages. We're all going to live celibate lives. We're all going to enter into monasteries and in terms of this going back to Adam and Eve, there may be a lot of reasons other than spiritual bondingness, or the fact that God was setting this up as an eternal example. And the very practical reason why I would think that God made just one woman was to ensure the unity and harmony of the human race. By having one woman and one man, there is no group of people that can say, we're not your same group of people. We're from wife number 2. And so the unity of the human race is an absolute assured fact by the fact that there was only one man and one woman. And I think that's a far more logical reason, if I can give logical as a reason, for only creating one woman than the fact that 2 wives would have been God's choice. I think that choice becomes evident as we move further on. So, give me another reason. I haven't found a good reason yet why I shouldn't, go out there and with my wife pick another second wife for me.
Well, God commands Christian leaders to be men of only one wife, and even in the Old Testament, it was a requirement for kings to not have too many wives. I don't remember exactly what the requirements were, so it seems that God prefers monogamy.
It seems that God prefers monogamy because we have one passage of Scripture that says that Bible leaders or church leaders in a particular period, in a particular culture, in a particular time should be the husband of one wife.
Oh, there's other examples. The Bible is pretty replete with examples, like David's household was filled with problems because of so many wives and kids,
yes,
and rape involved, and one of his sons usurped the throne for a length of time. Solomon got into a lot of trouble. If you look through the book of Ecclesiastes, he got off into really very worldly lifestyle and forgot the God of his youth. And not until he got much older and more mature, probably in the twilight of his life, did he finally come to his senses, as evidenced in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's Paul, of course, in the New Testament talks about being, deacons, I believe it was, should be the husband of one wife. And how their home is run is going to be a good indicator of how they would do in the church. So all these are examples of in favor of monogamous marriage, one wife, one husband, one wife.
All right, let me go back here and then we'll come here.
Also, if you look at the life of Jesus, he was raised by a woman and a man, not by a man and two women, vice versa. That's
All righty, we'll hold on to that one.
I was thinking perhaps, I don't know a lot about the context of this verse, but the one, the two shall become one flesh, seems to say that it would be difficult to become one flesh with many people, to have that kind of, it doesn't seem like that bond refers to you can do this with a lot of people.
The two shall become one flesh, not the three shall become one flesh. Well, can a man become one with more than one woman?
What's your definition of one?
I go back to the scriptures that talk about the reason why men shouldn't participate in going to prostitutes, and it says to the effect that we have no right to become one with a harlot. So it seems to me that a married man could become one with his wife and also one with a harlot. What constitutes that oneness? Is it just simply sexual bonding? Sexual activity?
No.
I don't think so.
No.
Well, let me ask you this. Is there any scripture anywhere that you can recall in which polygamy is criticized or prohibited to a believer? Your silence is well justified, because there is nothing in the scripture that ever condemns polygamy. Is there any scripture that says monogamy is God's preferred method of marriage? Well, there are hints, as you have suggested. There are hints, but there is the Bible is blessedly vague about this whole thing. And you'd think that this was something that was pretty important, wouldn't you? How come the Bible misses something so important? Why don't they just come through and say, look, guys, one wife and that's it, or else zap you with lightning or something. Well, let's talk about the strengths of monogamy. And then let's take a look at what the scriptures have to say. Let's talk about monogamy using the same line of argumentation that we used to defend polygamy. And you'll have to understand now, I want to bring this around now so that you don't think I'm just a dirty old man who's leering at middle-aged women. I really do not condone polygamy. I don't believe it's God's choice. But let's work our way intellectually through. What happens with you when you have monogamy? What are the advantages of a monogamous system? First of all, it encourages strong emotional bonds. And that was the first thing that I noticed in your responses. Whoa! There would be conflict between the two wives. There would be a division of the sense of loyalty. Monogamy does foster strong emotional bonds. Monogamy also reduces the possibility of competition between wives. And that's fairly evident. If you have more wives, you do have them fighting over who gets the best of this or the best of that. What about the inheritance for the kids, and et cetera, and et cetera. Monogamy also does another thing. It reduces competition between men. Once a guy's married, he's sporting that old wedding ring. Okay? Guys say, well, we don't have to worry about him anymore. He's not after the same women we're after, so they're not in the same kind of competition for the same available number of women. Once you're married, that's it. A fourth characteristic of monogamy is that it is much less economically demanding, at least in urban and industrial centers. As a matter of fact, it has been this characteristic that has demonstrated the death knell of polygamy in virtually every culture where polygamy has been approved. When people start moving into urban and industrial centers, polygamy becomes a hard way of life to maintain. Polygamy only functions well in agricultural or horticultural cultures. After that, it becomes financially problematic. So, having given you some reasons why monogamy is a good idea, using the same line of defense, let's now take a look at what the Bible talks about. The Bible never condemns polygamy. As a matter of fact, when we look at the scriptures, God even blesses polygamous marriages. And you talked about some of the problems that were associated with it. Yes, the Bible looks unscathingly at the problems of polygamous marriages, but it also does the same thing for monogamous marriages. When there were monogamous marriages that had problems, we discover the problems that are there, and the Bible constantly calls us to accountability in whatever kind of marriage we are in. We look at the New Testament and it discovers that it does advocate monogamy, at least for leaders. This is probably as strong a statement as you are going to find anywhere in the scriptures in support of monogamy. So, is that what we're going to have to live with? If we go to Africa, is that the best that we're going to be able to tell people who believe and who want an answer regarding monogamy? And my answer is no. The Bible does give an answer, but it does it in the way that Scripture is typically given to giving answers to complex social problems. It gives us cultural applications, and out of this we can draw cultural principles. And I would like to suggest that we look to the scriptures for what can best be called a one man, one woman principle. All right? One man, one woman principle. How do we derive the one man, one woman principle? Let's look at the various regulations regarding sexual behaviors that are described in the New Testament. First of all, sexual behaviors are regulated, first of all, through prohibitions against promiscuity. Now, in promiscuity, we're talking about unmarried people having sex with one another. So there's no marriage bond involved here. These are single men, single women having promiscuous relationships. These kinds of relationships are regulated against, for Christians, in the scriptures. Secondly, there are regulations against adultery. And adultery is marriage outside of the boundaries of a marriage relationship. A married woman having sex with somebody other than her husband. A married man having sex with somebody other than his lawfully wed wife. That's adultery. There is also prohibition in the scriptures against prostitution. Recreational sex is never approved in the scriptures, either by consent or by pay. And as a matter of fact, we have very, very clear regulations that we are not to be in unity, become one with a prostitute. And we have still a fourth regulation stating that if you get divorced, you are to remain single for the rest of your life. You are not to take another sexual partner. Now, these are 4 very, very specific kinds of sexual restraints or constraints. What is this telling us? What principle can we draw from each one of these 4 specific cultural applications of regulation on sexual behavior? And here is where I devise what I call the one man, one woman principle. And it is stated thusly: it was God's intent that in a sexually bonded relationship, a man and a woman shall become one in spirit, in body, in purpose, and that shall endure while they both live. That is the one man, one woman principle. Now, let me elaborate on this principle a little bit. I am convinced that the oneness of the marriage relationship is a complex of 3 components. It is a spiritual unity, it is a physical unity, and it is a unity of emotional commitment. So that the emotions are one. There's a fusing of the spirit of the two of you. There's a fusing of your bodies, and there is a spiritual oneness. It is more than just simply sexual union. I am not at all convinced that there is bonding in oneness when you have forcible rape, or when you have molestation, or you have an incestuous situation in which there is outright abuse. That does not constitute oneness. So this oneness is far more than simply the oneness of 2 bodies. It is a oneness of the entire being of these people as they give themselves in a loving relationship to one another. Now, this is God's intent. Now, God's intent is not always fulfilled in human culture. And this is where the rub comes. If this is what God's intent is, what about those who come to the Lord Jesus Christ who will not ever be able to meet that intent again for some reason or another? They have been sexually abused as a child. They have been molested. They have been raped. They have already entered into a marriage relationship, and that marriage fell apart. They have already entered into a polygamous marriage. See? And we get this all the time with people converting to Christianity from other cultures where you have polygamy. What do we do in such situations? And do you know what I find as I look at the scriptures? God is willing to take every one of us where we are at and to accept our humble submission to Him, and to accept our confession and our repentance, and to pick us up where we are at, and to say, I will bless you in your present situation and will continue to bless you. You do not have to consider that your life is devastated and impossible for me to bless anymore. And I have to say this because there are many young people who have entered into boyfriend-girlfriend relationships in high school or even in college, and those relationships broke up, and they said, why did I even agree to this? Why did we start living together? Why did we start having sex? Now I'm ruined forever. No. Life can start afresh with God's blessing on our lives by a commitment to Him. And this is even so for people who have been married and divorced. While I do not approve of divorce, there are sometimes actually when divorce is the only alternative. When you have an abusive situation, when you have sin that is destroying the lives of people, sometimes divorce is the answer. And the Bible gives divorce as an answer for human sin. And should people have to live for the rest of their lives without a partner because of a sinful relationship? I think not everybody will agree with me, but I think the Bible does allow for remarriage. For remarriage in which there was an outright violation of those vows, particularly in the case of adultery or of incest or of other activities that broke that trust bond between a husband and a wife. But I'll not get into that. I think that's something you need to work out with your theological profs around the place. But if it's a problem to you, come chat with me. I'm willing to talk about it, at least my own perception of it. Well, how many wives? How many wives? I think God wants us to have one wife. One person with whom we bond emotionally, spiritually. And there's a spiritual unity that comes in marriage. See? And physically. And out of that will grow a stable relationship. Well, how do we get into marriage? That's the next big question then. Whom God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. You ever hear those words? How do we determine who God puts together? Now, I had a young lady come several years ago, and she said, you know, I've got a boyfriend, and we're living together. And we're not married by the laws of the state, but we're married in God's eyes. By what line of reasoning do we have, see? What determines who God joins together? And I have had people come to my office and say, you know what? I married a guy, and as soon as we got married, I knew it was the wrong thing to do. This was a marriage that was made on earth, not in heaven. And while we are legally married, God never intended for us to be husband and wife, and I want out of the marriage now. Now, how do you advise somebody? Who has God bound together? Whom God has joined together? What's the basis for God's joining people together? Does the Scripture ever tell us? You want to know what? It doesn't. This is one more of those places where the Bible is blessedly vague on whom God hath joined together. And do you want to know something? You can look in vain in the theological dictionaries and theological treatises and in the Bible commentaries for some kind of an explanation for this passage of whom God hath joined together. And most commentators tiptoe through the tulips and they're off. They're out of here. They don't want to touch this one. But we cultural anthropologists, we go blundering through the tulips, see? Because we want answers to these kinds of problems. What constitutes joining together? You know what? I can't give you that answer. I can't give you that answer. I can only make some guesses that it has to do with both the social and the personal and the spiritual acknowledgement that a couple have become husband and wife. And somehow or another, the three go together. And sometimes one or more of those have to be dropped off. How many of you saw that movie, Braveheart? All right, it was just on TV. It was in the theaters a while back. And William Wallace, who's the hero of the story, wants to marry this delightful young woman in his village. But there's just one little problem. If he marries her, what happens? She has to spend the first night of her honeymoon in the bedroom of the sheriff, of the lord of the manor. One of those requirements. One of the requirements that was taking place in feudal days that was imposed by the English lords over the Scottish Highlanders. that they had the right to first sex with women who were being married. And so the wedding feast were always interrupted by the English soldiers who would drag off the brides to spend their first night with a nobleman. And William Wallace wanted nothing to do with that. So they have a marriage out in the forest with a priest, not socially acknowledged, but it's an acknowledgement before God. Now, here were a couple who were married before God, who made a deep commitment to one another, but it was not socially condoned. Was that a real marriage? Well, what about this young girl who came to me and said, well, we're not married in the eyes of the state, but we're sleeping together, we're living together, we're really married. Is that okay? What's the difference?
It's a vow that you make before God himself. He's witness to it. And you speak your vows to each other, and it's before God who's overseeing the transaction. And it's not a government, it's not a group of people, it's not a nobleman or a noble person.
We see this is one more of those cases where I find the Bible does a very interesting kind of thing. It gives us some concrete examples of what constitutes a legal marriage. But it allows us to work out the details on our own. And you know, we have a sense of when people are doing the right thing. You know, sometimes it is not possible. Sometimes we have to go against the laws of the society in order to have a bonding of a believing couple. And sometimes we give approval to that. There are times when it is impossible to make that kind of a covenant. There are other times when all three of those components must fit in. And I think the burden of proof rests upon anybody who varies from these cultural norms to justify it before a community of believers. Let me throw into this discussion now some of the components that have constituted marriage agreements, marriage contracts, all right? And let's see what the scriptures have to say about them. We want to talk first of all about bride wealth. Bride wealth has been a characteristic that has accompanied marital exchanges over the years. And in a bride wealth situation, a man pays the family of the bride a compensation for taking that woman out of her family and into his. This practice takes place in about 50% of the world's cultures. Frankly, it is a very powerful way of maintaining the value and the stability of a culture. It also helps to stabilize marriages. There is also what we call bride service, where the man works for the family of the bride. And this takes place in about 12.5% of the world's cultures. It's the kind of thing you see happening in the life of Jacob, when he had to work for his two wives for 14 years. And how long was that 14 years for poor old Jacob? Remember Jacob saying, and it was but a short time. Oh, isn't that love? Well, in addition to bride wealth, bride service, there's also a practice called dowry. Now, dowry is entirely different than bride wealth. Dowry is the practice of a woman bringing her share of her family inheritance to a marriage. This only takes place in about 5% of the world's cultures, Irish being one of them. And in this, the woman brings her inheritance to the wealth, and a man will often ask a woman, what kind of dowry are you bringing? Are you bringing any inheritance into this marriage? And Irishmen would not marry certain women because they were not able to bring wealth into the marriage. Now let's talk about these wealth exchanges. Bride wealth is not buying a wife. This was one of the mistakes that some of our early missionaries made when they went to Irian Jaya and said, oh, you've got to stop bride wealth because that's like buying a pig. You don't want to buy your wives like you buy pigs. No, it's not that at all. That's a complete misunderstanding of the purpose of bride wealth. You see, bride wealth is an expression of value of what a woman is capable of offering. A second thing that happens is that it does strengthen the social bonds between families, because now there is an exchange of wealth that is involved, and they are mutually obligated to one another. Bride wealth also encourages faithfulness. It encourages faithfulness. Because you know that a price has been paid, you feel more strongly attached to the man who has put out this phenomenal payment of wealth. There is still a fourth characteristic, and that is that it establishes self-worth. When we were working with the Dani of Irian in the respect to bride wealth, some of our missionaries were saying, we got to stop it, it's not a Christian practice. And when I showed up, they turned to me and said, Hayward, what do you think about bride wealth? And I said, it was practiced in the Old Testament. God never condemns bride wealth. If you want to have bride wealth, go ahead and have bride wealth. Well, they struggled with it. They struggled with it for years. And finally they came to me and they said, Hayward, we need a definitive answer from you. Is bride wealth something that we should continue or not? And I said, let me examine it with you. What happens if you don't pay bride wealth? They said, our daughters feel cheated. They feel like they're not worth anything. They feel like their husbands don't appreciate them. They don't feel like they're married. I said, that sounds like 4 reasons why you ought to keep bride wealth then. I said, what are the bad things about bride wealth? Well, I said, we fight about the wealth. We get greedy over it. I said, if that's the case, then why don't you give a bride wealth payment, but make it in the form of live pigs, which have to be killed at the marriage feast, so nobody walks away rich. But you have this huge feast for the whole village, in which the woman feels self-esteem and a privilege. They said, what a marvelous solution. And so they continued to have bride wealth as a Christian practice. Well, a fifth and final characteristic is that it legitimizes children in the marriage. Children are given a family name. They are recognized as being a member of a social group. So, I make another principal conclusion from all of these practices. The Bible does not advocate, condone, or condemn any cultural practice regarding how to take a spouse, so long as it is in harmony with the moral standards of God's living conditions for us. Nothing is condoned. Nothing is condemned. Anything that we agree, whether it be a Western practice, or an Asian practice, or a South Pacific practice, whatever works to bring a couple together, as long as it is in keeping with the moral standards, God allows that. And that becomes in the social contract that allows for the spiritual and the emotional bonding to take place. Question?
I was going to comment earlier. He talked about what God had put together, let not man put asunder. And I would argue that the Bible does explain that, because right before that it talks about in Genesis where a man leaves his mother and father and shall cleave to his one wife, and that's marriage. And if you look at the Old Testament, how they had the tokens of virginity, and say if a man saw a woman in the field and he had sex with her and she wasn't married, that it says that he would, and basically they would become husband and wife from that. And so I would argue that since our culture is so screwed up, when two people come together and have sex, as far as the bond, the tokens of virginity, etc. I'm
getting the word here. We have to cut it off because we're on the end of the tape. So let's continue it after the tape and after the class. That was the point I think that we wanted to make here. Let's go out and live our marriages as indeed Christian believers and followers of Jesus Christ. All right.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.